The spring breeze of 1979 carried the scent of fresh paint and sawdust across the old Jensen farm. Patrick O'Malley wiped sweat from his brow as he watched the workers reinforce the barn's crumbling foundation. The weathered structure had stood for nearly 7 decades, its wooden beams bearing silent witness to generations of farm life. "Mr. O'Malley!" A shout cut through the rhythmic pounding of hammers. "You better come see this." Patrick jogged across the muddy yard to where 3 workers huddled around a hole dug beneath the barn's north corner. Their faces wore expressions he couldn't quite read, a mixture of confusion and unease. "What is it?" he asked, peering into the excavated earth. "Hit something solid," the foreman replied, pointing to an object partially unearthed. "Doesn't feel like a rock." The rusted edge of a metal box peeked through the dirt, its surface caked with years of Nebraska soil. Patrick knelt down, brushing away clumps of earth with his fingers. "It's a toolbox," he said, confusion evident in his voice. Who the hell would bury a toolbox under a barn? The rectangular container, roughly 2 feet long and a foot wide, had clearly been deliberately placed there. A heavy padlock, orange with rust but still intact, sealed its contents from curious eyes. "Should we open it?" one of the workers asked. Patrick hesitated. "Number, call Sheriff Dalton." Sheriff Wade Dalton arrived 20 minutes later, his cruiser kicking up dust along the gravel driveway. At 54, Dalton's weathered face had seen plenty in his 3 decades of law enforcement, but the sight of that padlocked box unearthed beneath an old barn stirred something in his gut he couldn't ignore. "Nobody touched it?" he asked, crouching beside the hole, his knees cracking in protest. "Just dug around it," Patrick confirmed. Dalton nodded, pulling on a pair of gloves. "Let's get it out." The box was heavier than it looked. Once freed from its earthen prison, Dalton placed it on a tarp spread across the barn floor. The workers and Patrick formed a semicircle around it, curiosity battling with growing unease. "Lock's rusted through," Dalton muttered, examining the padlock. He retrieved bolt cutters from his cruiser, and with a single, decisive snap, the lock fell away. Time seemed to slow as Dalton lifted the lid. The metallic creak of hinges long unopened filled the suddenly silent barn. Then came a sharp intake of breath as the sheriff's face drained of color. Inside lay the unmistakable shape of human remains, a small skeleton, curled as if in sleep, bones yellowed with age. Fragments of fabric, a faded flannel shirt, clung to the rib cage. Nestled beside the skull was a broken pocket knife, its once polished surface now dulled by time. Dalton's eyes closed briefly. He knew immediately who he was looking at. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "It's the Jensen boy." Welcome to Last Seen Stories. If this is your first time here, I'm curious where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community of mystery lovers. To understand how a child's remains ended up in a toolbox beneath a barn floor, we need to travel back to the summer of 1971, when a 12-year-old farm boy named Caleb Jensen disappeared without a trace. Willow Creek, Nebraska, 1971. Population 2,346. The kind of place where church bells marked the hours, and everybody knew not just your name, but your business, your troubles, and which pie you'd bring to the county fair. The Jensen dairy farm sat 3 miles outside town, where cornfields stretched toward the horizon like a golden ocean. For 3 generations, Jensens had worked this land, coaxing life from soil and sustenance from livestock with the stubborn determination that defined Nebraska farmers. Ruth Jensen rose each morning at 4:30, her hands already preparing breakfast, while her mind planned the day's meals, laundry, and garden work. At 37, her once soft features had been gently hardened by wind, sun, and the constant labor of farm life. Yet her eyes remained kind, her smile ready, especially for her 3 children. Harold Jensen's day began even earlier, his broad shoulders and calloused hands testimony to years of physical labor. A man of few words, Harold communicated through actions. A firm handshake, a nod of approval, the gentle press of his hand on a child's shoulder after a job well done. In the pre-dawn darkness, he and his oldest son, Thomas, 16, would head to the barn for the morning milking. Harold's mother, Eleanor, Grandma Ellie, to the children, would shuffle down from her bedroom in the attic to help Ruth with breakfast. Then there were the younger Jensen children, 12-year-old Caleb and 9-year-old Lila. While Thomas had inherited his father's quiet nature and powerful build, Caleb was different. Slender, quick to laugh, brimming with questions about everything from cloud formations to how engines worked. "That boy's got more curiosity than a barn cat," Sheriff Dalton once remarked after watching Caleb dismantle and reassemble an old radio at the annual Willow Creek Harvest Festival. Caleb's days unfolded with the predictable rhythm of farm life, school during the academic year, and in summer, chores interspersed with adventures, fishing in Willow Creek with his friends, building elaborate forts in the hayloft, teaching Lila to skip stones across the pond beyond the west pasture. He was the glue, Ruth would later tell neighbors. Thomas was serious like his father. Lila was still so young, but Caleb, he brought everyone together. The Jensen farm operated like most in Willow Creek, on tight margins, hard work, and community support. When Harold's tractor broke down during planting season, the Peterson family loaned theirs without hesitation. When Lila needed a dress for the Easter service, Ruth received 3 hand-me-downs from church families the very next day. This was Willow Creek, a place where neighbors still gathered for barn raisings, where casseroles appeared on doorsteps during times of illness, where children played unsupervised until the dinner bell rang. It was a community that believed in the fundamental goodness of its members, a belief that would soon be tested in ways no one could have imagined. July 17, 1971, dawned hot and humid, the kind of summer day when the air hangs heavy and time itself seems to slow down. Ruth Jensen fanned herself with a church bulletin as she stood at the kitchen window, watching thunderheads build on the distant horizon. By evening, the weather would break, but for now, the farm shimmered under a merciless sun. Breakfast had been the usual affair: eggs from their chickens, bacon from the Petersons' pig, toast with Ruth's homemade strawberry preserves. Harold and Thomas had already headed to the North Field to repair irrigation lines. Grandma Ellie sat on the porch snapping beans for canning, while Lila practiced her penmanship at the kitchen table. Caleb had wolfed down his breakfast, eager to finish his chores. At 12, he'd recently been given more responsibility around the farm, a point of immense pride. "Don't forget to clean out the chicken coop before lunch," Ruth reminded him. "Already planned on it," Caleb replied, flashing the gap-toothed smile that always melted her heart. "And I fixed Lila's bicycle chain yesterday so she can ride with me to the creek after." Ruth nodded, ruffling his sandy hair. "Just be back by 4. Pastor Wilson's coming for dinner." The morning unfolded like countless others. Ruth heard Caleb whistling as he worked in the chicken coop, saw him chasing a stray hen across the yard, laughed as he dramatically recounted the story to Lila over a lunch of cold sandwiches and lemonade. At 1:37 p.m., Ruth would later remember the exact time. Having just checked the clock to see if she could start the pot roast, Harold's voice called from the yard, "Caleb, need your help, son." Ruth watched through the window as Caleb trotted across to his father, who stood by the pickup truck, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "The irrigation pump's busted again," Harold explained, his voice carrying through the open window. "Need you to get me the pipe wrench and channel locks from my toolbox in the storage shed." "The big one or the small one?" Caleb asked. "The big wrench, and grab some plumber's tape while you're at it." Caleb nodded and headed toward the storage shed, a small structure about 50 yards behind the barn. Ruth turned back to her cooking, humming softly as she peeled potatoes. The next hour passed in domestic routine. Ruth prepared dinner, Lila completed her summer reading, and Grandma Ellie dozed in her rocking chair. It wasn't until nearly 3 p.m. that Harold's heavy footsteps on the porch caught Ruth's attention. "Where's Caleb with those tools?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen, frustration evident in his voice. "Been waiting over an hour," Ruth frowned. "He went to the shed like you asked." Harold shook his head. "Never came back. Thought maybe you'd given him another chore." A small seed of concern planted itself in Ruth's chest. "Lila, have you seen your brother?" The little girl looked up from her book and shook her head. "Maybe he got distracted," Ruth suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know how he is, always chasing some new idea." Harold grunted, heading back outside. "I'll check the shed." Ruth watched through the window as Harold strode toward the storage shed, his pace quickening with each step. She saw him disappear inside, emerge moments later, then check the barn. When he began calling Caleb's name, the seed of concern blossomed into worry. By 4 p.m., the entire family was searching. Thomas checked Caleb's favorite fishing spot along the creek. Lila and Ruth searched the hayloft and every corner of the farmhouse. Harold drove the perimeter of their property, calling his son's name into the still afternoon air. No response. By dusk, the first neighbors had arrived to help search: the Petersons, the Clarks, the Wheelers. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the pastures and probed the darkening woods. Sheriff Dalton arrived, notebook in hand, asking the same questions again and again. When was he last seen? What was he wearing? Had he mentioned going anywhere? "He was just going to the storage shed," Ruth repeated, her voice growing hollow with each telling. "For tools. He was wearing blue jeans, a red and white check shirt, and his work boots." As night fell completely, the truth settled over the Jensen farm like a shroud. Caleb had vanished. The boy who always came running when called, who never missed dinner, who'd never wandered off without permission, had disappeared in the 50 yards between the yard and the storage shed. In that small stretch of familiar ground, Caleb Jensen had stepped out of his family's life and into rural Nebraska's most baffling mystery. Dawn broke on July 18th to find Willow Creek transformed. What had begun as a family's frantic search had evolved into a community-wide mobilization. Sheriff Dalton, who had spent the night coordinating from the Jensen's kitchen table, watched as farmers abandoned their own chores to join the effort. "We'll grid search the entire property," he announced to the gathered volunteers, "then expand outward. Nobody goes alone. Teams of 3 stay within eyesight of each other." The Jensen farm became Command Central. Ruth moved mechanically through her kitchen, brewing endless pots of coffee for searchers, her eyes constantly drifting to the window, hoping for a glimpse of her son trudging up the driveway. Harold had not slept. His face, normally stoic, now betrayed a quiet terror as he led teams through cornfields, drainage ditches, and the shallow waters of Willow Creek. Thomas remained close to his father, their shared silence heavier than words. By mid-morning, more than 80 people were searching, nearly every able-bodied adult in Willow Creek, plus volunteers from neighboring towns. 2 bloodhounds from the county sheriff's department followed Caleb's scent from the yard to the storage shed, then circled in confusion before leading handlers toward the barn. There the trail went cold. "Dogs can get confused," Deputy Miller explained to Ruth, not meeting her eyes. "Too many scents in a farmyard." Sheriff Dalton conducted interviews on the porch, jotting notes in his worn leather notebook. Each conversation revealed the same portrait of Caleb, a responsible boy, well-liked, with no reason to run away, no family troubles, no school problems, no secret girlfriend in the next county. "Could he have been taken?" Ruth finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she poured Dalton his 4th cup of coffee. The sheriff's hesitation was answer enough. "We're exploring all possibilities, Ruth." Theories multiplied as quickly as the search parties. Some townsfolk whispered about the drifter who'd passed through Willow Creek the previous week, seeking odd jobs. Others recalled the local legend of Harker's Woods, where decades earlier a child had supposedly wandered in and never emerged. "Could have fallen in an abandoned well," suggested Hank Peterson, voicing the fear of accidents that haunted rural parents. "Maybe he hitched a ride into town and got lost," offered Linda Wheeler, though nobody believed Caleb would leave without telling his parents. The most troubling theory remained largely unspoken: abduction. In 1971, rural Nebraska still considered itself immune to such urban horrors. Yet, as the search stretched into its second day without a trace of the boy, the unthinkable gradually became thinkable. On the third day, state police joined the investigation. The local newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, ran a front-page story with Caleb's school picture and the headline, "Local Boy Missing, Community Rallies." Each day without answers deepened the strain on the Jensen family. Harold withdrew further into himself, spending hours in the barn, mechanically completing chores. Ruth maintained a facade of hopeful energy, but neighbors noticed how her hands trembled as she hung laundry on the line. Thomas took over many of his father's responsibilities, suddenly thrust into adulthood at 16. Only Lila gave voice to the family's pain, crying out for her brother at night. "I should have been with him," Harold confessed to Sheriff Dalton a week into the search, his voice cracking. "Should have gone for the tools myself." "This isn't on you, Harold," Dalton said firmly. "We're going to find him." But as July stretched into August, the daily searches dwindled. Fields needed harvesting, livestock required tending, and life in Willow Creek reluctantly resumed its rhythm for everyone except the Jensens. If you're finding this story compelling, take a second to hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these important stories. Sheriff Dalton's investigation continued, but leads grew cold. The drifter was located 2 counties over and eliminated as a suspect. Reports of a suspicious vehicle near the Jensen farm proved to be a traveling salesman with an alibi. The ground-penetrating radar brought in to check for disturbed soil around the property revealed nothing unusual. By Labor Day, Caleb Jensen's disappearance had become something neighbors discussed in hushed tones, a collective wound that the community didn't know how to heal. His empty desk at Willow Creek Elementary stood as a silent memorial when school resumed in September. For the Jensens, the absence of answers was almost as unbearable as the absence of their son. Without evidence of an accident or crime, without a body to bury or a culprit to blame, they existed in an agonizing limbo, unable to properly grieve, yet forced to live with the growing likelihood that Caleb would never come home. The first Christmas without Caleb arrived like a storm no one was prepared for. Ruth set a place for him at the table, then removed it, then set it again. Each action a battle between hope and acceptance. Harold disappeared into the barn for hours, returning with red-rimmed eyes no one dared mention. Every night, Ruth left the porch light burning. "So he can find his way home," she explained, though no one needed the explanation. As 1972 unfolded, the Jensen family adapted to their new reality, each member carrying their grief differently. Thomas graduated high school that spring, but declined a scholarship to the University of Nebraska. "The farm needs me," he told his parents, though everyone understood he couldn't bear to leave them with their family incomplete. Lila became quieter, more serious, a shadow of the carefree girl she'd been. She took to carrying Caleb's pocket knife, his prized possession that he'd mysteriously left behind the day he vanished. "He'll want it back when he comes home," she insisted. Harold worked longer hours, pushing his body to exhaustion, as if physical pain might dull the emotional torment. The neighbors whispered about his decline, how his shoulders stooped more each month, how he rarely spoke at church or community gatherings. Only Ruth maintained an outward semblance of normalcy, though the effort aged her visibly. She continued attending social functions, volunteering at school, participating in church activities, all while scanning every crowd, every street, every passing car for a glimpse of her missing son. Sheriff Dalton checked in regularly, though his visits grew less frequent as months turned to years. The case file remained open on his desk, but new emergencies demanded his attention, and the trail had gone cold. "I'm not giving up, Ruth," he promised, during a visit on the second anniversary of Caleb's disappearance. "Just wanted you to know that." By 1975, Caleb's story had faded from local headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and triumphs. At community gatherings, people no longer asked the Jensens for updates. The unspoken understanding was that Caleb Jensen was gone, another name on the growing national list of missing children whose cases might never be solved. Yet in Willow Creek, his absence remained a splinter in the community's consciousness, a reminder that even in places where doors went unlocked and neighbors watched out for each other's children, darkness could still slip through the cracks. Thomas married Linda Wheeler in 1976, bringing a daughter-in-law to the Jensen farm who'd never known Caleb except through stories and photographs. Their wedding was a bittersweet affair. Happiness mingled with the ache of an empty chair where a teenage brother should have sat. Lila graduated high school in 1978 and, unlike her brother, chose to leave, attending nursing school in Lincoln, 60 miles away. "I can't breathe here anymore," she confessed to her mother. "Everything reminds me of him." That same year, Harold's health began to fail. Years of physical strain and emotional burden had weakened his heart. After his first minor heart attack, doctors advised him to sell the farm, advice he flatly rejected. But reality proved stronger than determination. By early 1979, with Harold unable to manage the demanding physical labor and Thomas wanting to start his own farm closer to his wife's family, the painful decision was made to sell the Jensen property. Ruth packed up their belongings mechanically, sorting through 8 years of accumulated memories. Caleb's room remained largely untouched, his baseball gloves still hanging on the bedpost, model airplanes suspended from the ceiling, books lined neatly on shelves. She boxed these treasures carefully, unable to discard them, yet equally unable to look at them daily. The O'Malleys, Patrick and Diana, seemed like the perfect buyers, a young couple with dreams of restoring the aging farmhouse and making the land productive again. They spoke respectfully of the Jensen family's history there and promised to honor the property's legacy. What none of them could have known was that the land itself held the answer to the mystery that had haunted the Jensen family for 8 long years, an answer buried beneath the floorboards of the very barn where Harold had spent countless hours seeking solace in work. An answer that would bring both closure and new wounds to a family and community that had never truly healed. April 17, 1979. The renovation of the old Jensen barn was Patrick O'Malley's passion project. Where others saw a deteriorating structure ready for demolition, he envisioned a restored piece of Nebraska history, sturdy beams, fresh paint, a new purpose for old spaces. "The foundation's rotting on the north corner," Miles Hoffman, the contractor, had warned. "We'll need to dig it out, pour new concrete." Patrick had agreed immediately. He wanted this barn to stand another 70 years. The work began on a Monday. By Wednesday afternoon, the workers had excavated 3 feet down around the problematic corner when shovel struck metal. "Probably just some old farm equipment," Miles suggested, as they brushed away soil to reveal the rectangular shape. People used to bury all sorts of junk. But Patrick's instincts told him this was different. The care with which the toolbox had been buried, well below frost line, positioned horizontally, sealed with a heavy padlock, suggested intention, not disposal. When Sheriff Dalton arrived 30 minutes later, the workers had cleared enough soil to fully expose the container, but left it in place. The sheriff's reaction upon seeing it was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes, a slight paling beneath his weathered tan. "Let's get it out," he instructed, his voice deliberately calm. The removal took 20 minutes of careful digging. When the box finally lay on the tarp in the center of the barn floor, decades of buried history exhumed into the light. Sheriff Dalton stared at it with a mixture of dread and grim anticipation. "You folks mind stepping back?" he asked the small crowd of workers. "Give me some room here." The lock, though corroded, remained intact, a master padlock, common enough but sturdy. Dalton retrieved bolt cutters from his vehicle and with a single decisive cut severed the connection between past and present. The metallic groan of the lid opening echoed through the barn like a sigh. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon sunlight that illuminated the box's contents. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Inside lay the unmistakable form of a child's skeleton, curled in what might have been mistaken for sleep, if not for the surrounding circumstances. The bones had yellowed with age, but remained intact, protected from the elements by their metal coffin. Fragments of fabric, a red and white checked pattern still faintly visible, clung to the remains. But it was the small object nestled near where the child's hand would have been that caused Sheriff Dalton's breath to catch, a pocket knife with a distinctive wooden handle, split down the middle. "Jesus," whispered Miles, peering over Dalton's shoulder. "Is that—" "Caleb Jensen," Dalton confirmed, his voice hollow. 8 years of wondering, searching, questioning, answered in the most horrific way possible. Someone call the county coroner. Nobody touches anything. Patrick O'Malley stood frozen, trying to process the revelation that his dream home had been built upon a nightmare. Who would do this, he managed? Bury a child under a barn? Sheriff Dalton's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, not just the box and its contents, but their location. The barn's north corner, away from the main doors, beneath solid flooring that wouldn't have been disturbed in the normal course of farm work. "Someone who knew this farm," he said quietly. "Someone who knew they wouldn't be found." The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, electric in its horror and confirmation. By nightfall, cars lined the road near the O'Malley property. Former neighbors, community members, the morbidly curious, all kept at a distance by deputy sheriffs who'd established a perimeter around the crime scene. The county coroner, Dr. Howard Levin, worked methodically inside the barn, photographing and documenting every detail before the remains were carefully transferred to a proper container for transport to the county morgue. "This wasn't a recent burial," he told Sheriff Dalton as they stood in the gathering dusk. "Based on decomposition and soil conditions, I'd estimate these remains have been here 7 to 10 years. Dalton nodded grimly. Timeline fits. Inside the toolbox, along with the remains and clothing fragments, investigators found 3 additional items: the broken pocket knife, a small toy soldier that had once been painted red, and a length of rope approximately 3 feet long, frayed at both ends. As floodlights illuminated the scene into the night, casting long shadows across the barnyard where Caleb Jensen had last been seen alive, Sheriff Dalton faced his most difficult task yet, informing the Jensen family that their 8-year mystery had been solved in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The county morgue in Lincoln rarely handled cases of this magnitude. Dr. Howard Levin, who had served as coroner for 15 years, called in additional expertise, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Nebraska and a senior crime scene investigator from the state police. The remains arrived in a sealed container, each bone, fabric fragment, and personal effect carefully preserved. The examination room, clinical and bright, stood in stark contrast to the dark earth and weathered barn where the body had rested for nearly a decade. Male child, approximately 10 to 13 years of age, Dr. Levin dictated into his recorder as the team began their work. Height consistent with a 12-year-old based on bone measurements. The anthropologist, Dr. Susan Martinez, carefully examined each bone, noting any anomalies or indicators of trauma. "There's a healed fracture on the left radius," she observed. "Probably from a fall, completely healed. Happened at least a year before death." Ruth Jensen would later confirm that Caleb had broken his arm falling from the hayloft when he was 10. The most significant findings came from the cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck. C2 through C4 show fracture patterns consistent with strangulation, Dr. Martinez reported, pointing to the subtle damage visible only to trained eyes. Hyoid bone is also fractured. Death was likely due to asphyxiation. While the scientists worked to determine cause of death, Sheriff Dalton focused on identification. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. The location, the age estimate, the clothing fragments, matching what Caleb had worn the day he disappeared. But scientific confirmation was necessary. Dental records provided the first definitive link. Caleb's distinctive dental work, including a space where he'd lost a molar just months before his disappearance, matched the remains perfectly. "It's him," Dalton confirmed to his deputy after receiving the dental report. "No doubt about it." The pocket knife found with the remains proved equally significant. Lila Jensen, now 21, identified it immediately when shown photographs. "That's Caleb's knife," she stated without hesitation. "Grandpa gave it to him for his 10th birthday. The handle cracked when he tried to use it to pry open a paint can, but he still carried it everywhere." As the forensic picture came together, Sheriff Dalton faced the painful task of sharing these details with the Jensen family. He drove to Lincoln, where Ruth and Harold had relocated after selling the farm, arriving at their modest bungalow on a quiet residential street. Ruth knew instantly from his expression. "You've confirmed it," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Dalton nodded, removing his hat as Harold joined them in the small living room. "I'm so sorry." "How?" Harold asked, the single word containing years of anguish. "The evidence suggests he was strangled," Dalton replied gently. "It would have been quick." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, and then buried in a toolbox under our own barn. The bitter irony wasn't lost on any of them. The countless hours Harold had spent in that very barn after Caleb's disappearance, seeking solace through work, unknowingly feet away from his son's body. "Who?" Harold demanded, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "Who did this to my boy?" "That's what we're going to find out," Dalton promised. "We have physical evidence now, fibers, the rope, fingerprints from the toolbox, and we know something critical. Whoever did this knew your farm well, knew where to bury him, where he wouldn't be found." The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't a random act by a passing drifter or stranger. This was someone familiar with the Jensen property, possibly someone they knew. The forensic team's final report, delivered 3 days later, confirmed what many had suspected. Caleb Jensen had been murdered, his body concealed with deliberate care by someone who never expected the barn's foundation to be excavated. This case has so many layers to it. What do you think happened to Caleb? Share your theories in the comments below. With scientific confirmation complete, attention turned to the question that had haunted Willow Creek for 8 years. Who had killed Caleb Jensen, and why had they hidden his body beneath the family's own barn? The confirmation that Caleb Jensen had been murdered, not lost, not run away, not the victim of a tragic accident, sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The community that had grieved his disappearance now faced a more sinister reality. Evil had walked among them, perhaps still did. "Lock your doors tonight," mothers told their children, a practice once rare in rural Nebraska. For the Jensen family, the discovery brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was closure, yes. The torturous uncertainty finally resolved, but with it came fresh grief, as if Caleb had died all over again. "At least we can bury him properly," Ruth told Pastor Wilson, who had remained a steadfast support through the years. "Give him a resting place with dignity, The funeral was held at Willow Creek Methodist Church, the same white clapboard building where the Jensens had once prayed weekly for Caleb's safe return. The pews overflowed with community members, many of whom had participated in those long-ago searches. Caleb's remains, now properly contained in a polished oak casket, were flanked by photographs from happier times: Caleb fishing, Caleb on his bicycle, Caleb holding his 4-H ribbon from the county fair. These images of life stood in stark contrast to the reality within the closed casket. Thomas delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "My brother loved this community," he said, surveying the gathered faces. "He trusted the people here. Someone betrayed that trust in the worst possible way." Those words lingered in the church long after the service concluded, coloring every interaction in Willow Creek with subtle suspicion. If Caleb had been killed by someone who knew the farm, who was that person? A neighbor, a family friend, someone still living among them. The Jensen farm itself, now legally owned by the O'Malleys, acquired a dark reputation. Children whispered about it being haunted. Farmers driving past crossed themselves. The barn, despite Patrick O'Malley's renovation efforts, became a macabre landmark, the place where Caleb Jensen's body had lain hidden for 8 years. "We're thinking of selling," Diana O'Malley confided to her sister on the phone. "I can't sleep knowing what happened here." For the Jensens, the barn had become a symbol of unimaginable betrayal. Harold, whose health had been fragile before the discovery, suffered another heart attack 2 weeks after the funeral. He survived, but the incident left him further weakened, both physically and emotionally. "I worked in that barn every day," he told Sheriff Dalton during a visit to the hospital. "Stood above my boy's body and never knew it. What kind of father doesn't sense something like that?" Ruth channeled her renewed grief into action, joining a newly formed national organization advocating for missing children. Her quiet strength became a source of inspiration for other families navigating similar tragedies. Lila, who had distanced herself from Willow Creek years earlier, found herself drawn back into the investigation. The nursing student returned home on weekends, poring over old photographs, talking to former neighbors, trying to identify anyone who might have harbored ill will toward her brother or family. "I remember everything about that day," she told Sheriff Dalton. "I remember everyone who came to the farm that week. Someone in those memories is a killer." As the Jensen family processed their renewed grief, Willow Creek itself underwent a transformation. The town that had once prided itself on its close-knit, trusting nature now viewed that same connectedness with suspicion. If the killer had been someone familiar with the Jensen farm, it meant the murderer might be someone they all knew, perhaps someone they still interacted with regularly. Friendships cooled. Community gatherings grew tense. People scrutinized their neighbors' reactions to news about the case, watching for any sign of unusual interest or discomfort. "It's like poison in the well," Pastor Wilson observed to his wife. "One act of evil has tainted everything." Yet, alongside the suspicion, ran a current of determination. The discovery had reopened old wounds, but it had also provided new evidence, new possibilities for justice. The community that had once searched for a missing boy now united in the search for his killer. "Whoever did this has walked free for 8 years, Sheriff Dalton told the crowd at a town meeting. "That ends now." With physical evidence finally in hand, Sheriff Dalton transformed his office into a war room dedicated to solving Caleb Jensen's murder. Photos, timelines, and suspect lists covered the walls. The toolbox itself, now emptied of its grim contents, sat on a table as a constant reminder of what was at stake. "We're looking for someone with 3 key characteristics," Dalton explained to his deputies. 1, they knew the Jensen farm well enough to select that hiding spot. 2, they had access to the barn and tools to remove and replace the floorboards. 3, they had a motive to harm Caleb specifically. The first round of interviews focused on farm workers who had access to the Jensen property In 1971, Frank Doherty, who had helped with harvests for 3 seasons, now lived in Iowa. Deputies tracked him down, confirming his alibi. He'd been hospitalized for appendicitis the week Caleb disappeared. Miguel Santos, a seasonal worker who had briefly lived in the Jensen spare room, had returned to Mexico years earlier. Border Patrol records confirmed he'd crossed back into Mexico 2 months before Caleb's disappearance. Each lead investigated and eliminated narrowed the field of suspects, bringing Sheriff Dalton closer to the truth, a truth he was beginning to suspect might be more complicated than anyone had imagined. A breakthrough came when forensic technicians recovered a partial fingerprint from inside the toolbox's metal latch. Though degraded by time and conditions, enough ridge detail remained for comparison against prints on file. Simultaneously, Lila Jensen's persistent memory work yielded an important detail, a conflict she'd overheard the summer Caleb disappeared but had been too young to understand its significance. Uncle Victor, she told Sheriff Dalton during their 3rd interview, Dad's younger brother. He and Dad argued about money that summer. I remember because they never fought, but this was different. Victor was shouting about deserving part of the farm. Victor Jensen, Harold's only sibling, had moved to Colorado in 1972, ostensibly for a mining job. He rarely returned to Nebraska and had not attended Caleb's funeral, citing poor health. Checking his background, Dalton discovered a series of failed businesses, gambling debts, and a domestic violence complaint from an ex-girlfriend. What do we know about Victor's relationship with Caleb? Dalton asked Ruth during a follow-up interview. Ruth's expression darkened. Victor resented the children, said Harold was lucky to have a son to inherit the farm while he had nothing. He was particularly hard on Caleb, criticized him constantly, called him soft. This new line of inquiry quickly gained momentum. County records revealed Victor had contested his father's will in 1966, arguing that as a second son, he deserved half the Jensen farm, not just the cash settlement he'd received. The court had ruled against him, creating a bitter rift between the brothers that Harold had attempted to heal by occasionally hiring Victor for odd jobs. Was Victor at your farm the week Caleb disappeared? Dalton asked. Yes, Harold confirmed, his face ashen with the implication. He helped me fix the tractor 2 days before, stayed for dinner. The partial fingerprint provided the final damning piece of evidence. When compared against Victor Jensen's prints, on file from a 1975 arrest for disorderly conduct, the match was unmistakable. Armed with a warrant, Sheriff Dalton and 2 state police officers drove to Lakewood, Colorado, where Victor Jensen, now 52, lived in a rundown apartment complex. They found him watching television, a half-empty whiskey bottle on the coffee table. "Took you long enough," Victor said upon seeing their badges, a statement that chilled Dalton's blood. Back in Nebraska, under interrogation, Victor Jensen's facade of indifference gradually crumbled. He maintained his innocence through the first 3 hours, dismissing the fingerprint evidence as expected. "Of course, my prints are on Harold's tools. I worked there." But when presented with the rope fibers that matched material found in his Colorado apartment, and confronted with Lila's recollections of his arguments with Harold, Victor's defiance gave way to a cold, calculated confession. "It wasn't supposed to be Caleb," he said finally, staring at the wall behind Dalton's head. "It was supposed to be Harold." The story that emerged was one of festering resentment, financial desperation, and opportunity. Victor, facing mounting gambling debts, had returned to the farm with a plan to stage an accident for his brother, an accident that would eliminate Harold and potentially position Victor to help the grieving widow manage the farm. "I rigged a pulley in the barn to fail when enough weight was put on it," Victor explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "Harold always checked the hayloft pulleys each week. It would have looked like an accident." But Caleb had entered the barn unexpectedly, catching his uncle in the act of sabotage. "He asked what I was doing up there," Victor continued, "said he was getting tools for his dad. Smart kid. Too smart. He knew something wasn't right. What followed was a split-second decision with tragic consequences. Victor, fearing exposure, had grabbed Caleb from behind, using the rope he'd brought for the pulley system to silence the boy. He hadn't intended to kill, or so he claimed, but panic and adrenaline led to excessive force. "When I let go, he was already gone," Victor said flatly. "I never meant for the kid to die." The toolbox had been Harold's, an old one kept in the storage shed replaced years earlier, but never discarded. Victor had buried it beneath the barn floor in the early morning hours, carefully replacing the floorboards, then joined the search parties the next day, offering support to the family whose lives he'd destroyed. "And you just let them suffer for 8 years, Dalton said, disgust evident in his voice. "Watched Harold blame himself. Watched Ruth keep that porch light on." Victor Jensen offered no defense, no explanation for his silence. The man who had carried his secret for nearly a decade, while his family suffered unimaginable pain, showed no remorse beyond a pragmatic acknowledgement of his actions. As deputies led Victor away to await formal charging, Sheriff Dalton was left with the hollow victory of a case solved, but lives irreparably damaged, and the knowledge that the monster who had haunted Willow Creek for 8 years had been part of the Jensen family all along. Victor Jensen's trial in February 1980 lasted just 4 days. The evidence against him, the fingerprint, the rope fibers, his own confession, left little room for legal maneuvering. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of second-degree murder and concealing a body. Judge Robert Callahan, a father of 4 who had known the Jensen family for decades, delivered the maximum sentence, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. "You didn't just take a child's life," Judge Callahan told Victor during sentencing. "You destroyed a family and betrayed an entire community's trust. There is no punishment adequate for such actions." For the Jensen family, the trial brought a measure of justice but little peace. Harold, his health continuing to decline, attended each day of proceedings in a wheelchair, his eyes never meeting his brother's. Ruth sat beside him, straight-backed and dignified in her grief. "I keep asking myself if there were signs," she confided to Sheriff Dalton after the verdict. "Something we should have seen in Victor. Some warning." "This isn't on you," Dalton assured her, echoing the words he'd spoken to Harold years earlier. "Some things can't be predicted or prevented." In the months following the trial, Willow Creek began the slow process of healing. The suspicion that had poisoned community relationships gradually dissipated as the truth about Victor Jensen spread. Neighbors who had grown distant reconnected, united by their shared horror at what had happened and relief that the perpetrator had not been among their daily acquaintances. The O'Malleys ultimately decided to stay, though they demolished the barn where Caleb's body had been found, replacing it with a new structure built on a different part of the property. On the original site, they planted a small garden with a memorial stone bearing Caleb's name, a gesture of respect that touched the Jensen family deeply. For Ruth, the confirmation of Caleb's fate, though devastating, allowed her to finally move forward. The night after Victor's sentencing, she turned off the porch light she had kept burning for 8 years. "He's at rest now," she explained to Lila. "He knows his way home." Harold Jensen never recovered from the physical and emotional toll of his son's death and his brother's betrayal. He passed away in 1982, his heart finally giving out after years of strain. Those close to the family believed he died as much from grief as from any medical condition. Ruth found purpose in advocating for missing children, helping to establish one of Nebraska's first chapters of a national missing children's organization. Her quiet strength and resilience inspired countless families navigating similar tragedies. Thomas Jensen eventually purchased a small farm near Lincoln, where he and Linda raised 3 children, including a son named Caleb, who grew up knowing the uncle he'd never met through photographs and carefully edited stories. Lila completed nursing school and moved to California, putting physical distance between herself and the memories of Nebraska. Yet she returned each year on the anniversary of Caleb's funeral, bringing flowers to the cemetery where her brother and eventually her parents were buried. Sheriff Wade Dalton continued serving Willow Creek until his retirement in 1986. Solving Caleb's case remained the most significant achievement of his career, though he took little satisfaction in its resolution. "Some victories taste like ashes," he often remarked. Victor Jensen died in prison in 2003, taking to his grave his deeper motivations and whatever remorse he might have developed during his incarceration. No family members attended his funeral. Today, few residents of Willow Creek remember firsthand the summer of 1971 when a farm boy disappeared, or the spring of 1979 when his remains were found in a toolbox beneath a barn floor. The story has become local legend, told to teenagers at slumber parties or mentioned in hushed tones when a child strays too far from watchful eyes. Yet the case left an indelible mark on the community, a reminder that even in places where neighbors know each other's business and children play freely until sunset calls them home, darkness can lurk beneath familiar surfaces. The tragedy of Caleb Jensen taught Willow Creek, and perhaps all who hear his story, that some secrets refuse to stay buried, eventually working their way to the light, no matter how deeply they've been hidden. For the Jensen family, Caleb's story remains one of unimaginable loss, but also of a truth finally revealed, a painful reckoning that allowed them, after 8 long years of wondering, to finally lay their son, their brother, their unanswered question, to rest. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to Last Seen Stories for more mysteries that deserve to be remembered. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who appreciates true mysteries.